Now that we learned about the syntax and semantics of two-dimensional arrays, I would like to now develop the ultimate final solution for solving the mileage calculation problem. And if you recall from version 1b, so this is the version where we actually define some helper method. We're going to use it still. However, you can see the main drawback is we actually got several separate one-dimensional arrays over here separately. So that's why we still actually have to do the if conditional checks over here, right? That's the drawback that we spoke about in the previous part of the video this week. So now I would like to improve this by saying, so now that you learn about how to use one-dimensional array, you can see each one of these can just be rows of my two-dimensional array. Agree? So now I want to somehow create another single variable of type two-dimensional array and then assign each one of these to be its rows. That's what I would do. So why don't we try that? So what I would do is I'm going to, let me close this, right click on 1b and then copy and then click on the console apps package and say paste. Okay, I want it to be just 2, just one single version for version 2 and say okay. And then I will double click on this and let's maximize it. Okay, I will still use this index of helper method. It will still be handy to figure out the indices to really get access to the arrays either at the one dimension or either at the first dimension or the second dimension. They will still be useful. Okay, I'm going to keep that. And these name constant will also be useful. Let me keep them as well. So now what I will do is out of these variables, separate variables, I'm going to create one more. Okay, so now you can actually, based on what we learned previously, you can kind of predict what I'm going to type. So I'm going to say integer array over here. So the first dimension is the first dimension of array. Each slot is going to store another array, right? And that array is going to be of type integer. So you can think about each row is going to be an array of integer. So this can be one row. This can be second row and third row and etc. Right? So what do I say that it's going to be an array called distance over here, and that it's going to be reassigned to. I can say from Chicago the first row, and then from Boston, from New York, and also from Atlanta, and also from Miami, and also from Dallas. Oh, actually from Dallas and also from Houston. Okay, so these are the 7 rows, right? Alternatively, let me show you an alternative version. Let me just show you this, right? You can see row number 1, row number 2, row number 3, and also row number 4, 5, 6, and 7. This is definitely one way to go, and we have seen this already from the previous one, from the previous video. Alternatively, you can do this. Let me write it down and then I will comment it out later. You can also say integer array, and also distance, right? Of course, I'm going to comment it out. You can say, let me say distance 2 over here. It can be, for example, like that. And then I'm going to define each row explicitly over here. So this can be, let me just copy these over here and then paste it over here. So this will be row number 1, row number 2, row number 3, row number 4, row number 5, row number 6, row number 7, and of course each one of them is like a member array, so they should be separated by comma. Each array in the second dimension is like the starting address of each array in the second dimension is stored in the a slot in the one-dimensional array, right? That's what we spoke about previously. Okay, comma, comma, and comma, like that. Right, so alternatively, you can also do this, right? Of course, you can fix the indentation over here. I think that's pretty nice, right? I'll just comment this out over here. You can choose which version you like. It's completely up to you, okay? I'm going to keep this version here, which is equivalent. How many cities in your itinerary? Pretty much the same as before. I'm going to do error handling in a moment. Let's make sure at least for the normal cases where all the cities are defined, it will at least work. Okay, so all I need to do is, right now, so now we're going to improve it, right? So now we got indices for departure and also destination, right? And now we don't need this anymore, right? So this is really the critical part about improvement. I don't need this anymore. So now can you tell me what I need to type? the current distance over here can be directly I may not need this anymore, actually, to be honest. I can simply just get rid of this. So now the distance, which is declared outside the loop, it can now be accumulated actually using what? Pause the video and think about what you should really type in terms of this particular array over here. What should I do? All right, assuming that you pause the video, why don't we try? So I can say over here, distance, and then, oh, by the way, how does the distance look like? Let me just visualize that very quickly together with you. Let's say, for example, well, that's really what's really being created at a runtime. So it's a two-dimensional array. You can think about distance stores the starting address of this particular array in the first dimension, which got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows. Each slot stores the starting address of that particular row, which is of size 7. Right? So now, for example, if I want to figure out the distance between, and also here I'm just using the name constant over here that we declare. How can I find out the distance, let's say from Atlanta to Miami? In that case, I'm really looking for this particular intersection, right? You can see the intersection between here and here. And now, how can I get access to it? Atlanta corresponds to index 3 in the first dimension. And also Miami corresponds to index 4 in the second dimension. So I should really say distance at index 3, which will point to this particular array, and then I should go to index 4, which will point to, which will give me this particular intersection, right? So hopefully that you're following. And then I'm going to trace one more time, and then hopefully you can see that that's exactly what's being visualized. Okay, let's now move back to Eclipse. And then what I wanted you to say is, what should be the index for departure, right? I'll put departure index over here. Oops. I should say departure index and also destination index. You might be wondering, why can we not actually simply put that departure over here and destination over here? It's because these are indices, so you just cannot pass a string value. You should really figure out exactly what the index departure city and also destination city really correspond to by calling the helper method, which we did in the previous video, right? And that's it. You can see how much simpler it is eventually, right, using two-dimensional array. However, if I simply just gave you this solution in the very first video, that might save time. However, you wouldn't really appreciate how we can transition from one-dimensional array solution into two-dimensional array solution, right? Okay, and then there's something we need as well. Oh, you know what? Current distance actually does have its use. So why don't I introduce it back, right? I regret, sorry. So current distance over here will be assigned to, and then this guy over here, and then let's just put it back. Yeah, because we need to print out a breakdown, so we definitely need it. And so this part over here will be current distance, right? So it can be reused in both accumulation and also for the breakdown printout over here. So why don't we try our initial example about itinerary of size 4, and then to make sure it works, and I will briefly extend the program for error handling, and then we are done. Okay, so why don't I launch the console, and then how many cities? Let's say 4, and then the first one is Boston. Yeah, make sure you type without any spelling mistake, and also Chicago, and then Miami, and then Houston. All right, you can see that's exactly what we have seen, right? In the previous version, right? You can see the two versions from the external user's point of view, they have the same correct behavior. However, we have done some dramatic, substantial refactoring, meaning that we have changed from multiple one-dimensional array variables in version number 1, either A or B, into this version number 2 by using just a single two-dimensional variable. You can see the code structure is much simpler, meaning that it's much more maintainable for future extension. Okay, so hopefully you can appreciate that. All right, so now we are done with this correct version over here. And let me now just launch the debugger just to show you something quickly. And then I'm going to extend the program with error handling. Okay, so what I would do is I'm going to actually put, let's say after we have done reading all the cities, right? Let's now launch the debugger. So it's going to be debug mileage app 2. and then how many cities? Let's say 4, and then Boston, and also Chicago, and then Miami, and also Houston. And then we're going to switch to the debug perspective. All right, so over here, let's now first of all see how the distance array will look like, right? You can see the distance array is really important to visualize it also in the debugger. So if you click on distance over here, you can see that one there is more like a single line version, but let's see this. You can see this, this how I break it down in the previous video. You can think about, let me just do it quickly. Okay, you can see a single line, not that easy to view. You can think about this is really the first row, and this part over here is the second row. Okay, easier to see it this way. Let me remove all the previous breakpoints, and now let's see this. If I say distance over here is basically the one-dimensional array, and if you look at that, index 0 is actually just another array over here, right? You can see that particular array is of type integer array. If you click on this, you can see that's the first row, and then if you click on that, the second row, and also the third row, and etc. And if you want to go to maybe distance, index 0 for the first dimension, and index 3 for the second dimension, you will get 714, right? Let me just give you one more example. You can say, for example, distance over here at index maybe 2. So now this one here is basically a integer array. That's actually in the second dimension. It's the third one in the second dimension. I can also say, I want to say here, distance, the third array in the second dimension, and also I want to go to its slot at index maybe 3, right? In that case, I'm gonna get 888. You can look it up to make sure that's actually correct. All right, let's now move on very quickly, and let's now see the trip. If you remind yourself about the trip over here, you can see the trip is actually going to be the 4 cities, Boston and also Chicago, right? And now let's remind ourselves about the table, right? You can see Boston and Chicago over here. So we basically we want to see the distance for the very first iteration, the distance between Boston, the departure city, and also the, let me use blue maybe. So that will be the first dimension. So we want to go from Boston to Chicago. Chicago is actually over here, right? So what we are really talking about is this particular cell over here. How can we get there? So to get there, we really need to index 1 for the first dimension, and also go to index 1, go to index 0 for the second dimension. So in total, we're actually going to say distance, let me write it down. It's going to be distance it's going to be 1 and then 0. That's what we need to, what we will see in the debugger, right? So distance over here, and then go to index 1, and then go to index 0, and then you get this particular number. Let's take a look. And let's now step over. You can see departure over here. If you look at departure, it's actually Boston, and destination is Chicago. They're both string values, which cannot be used directly for the index over here. So that's why we want to call the helper method index off and figure out the indices, right? So we know the answer already. One should be 1, the other one should be 0. Let's say step over. So departure index should be 1 and also 0 over here, right? So what we will actually end up doing is, so the distance array, and then go to departure index, which is 1, and then go to destination index, which will be 0, right? And then we should really expect to see this particular value to be set, 983. And let's try to do it. And if I say step over here, you can see the current distance has been changed over here, 983, right? That's been changed. All right, so that's about what I want to show you. You can still carry on further for the iterations if you want to confirm further. Otherwise, we can move on to the final bits for this application. We want to support some error handling. At the moment, we actually will have trouble if the city is actually passed does not exist in the distance table. You can see only Chicago, Boston, New York, Atlanta, etc., right? What if I try this? Let's say I only want to do, let's say, 2 cities, for example, and then let's say Toronto to Boston, right? It's going to be some exception. I can tell you briefly, but you can use the debugger. I encourage you to do so to really find out why it will be an array index out of bound exception. The reason, if you click on this, is in line number 98 for the app over here. So let's see this. Exactly here. Sometimes it does not go directly, but you can just go to line 98 over here. The problem is somehow one of the indices happen to be -1. It is because when I enter Toronto, so Toronto will be the trip array is going to store Toronto and also Boston, 2 elements. And for the departure city Toronto, when I invoke index of Toronto, so what would I get? If you look at that, index of Toronto, apparently Toronto is not listed as one of the defined cities. So eventually, you'll simply keep the initial value -1, and then you're using -1 to actually index into the distance array, right? So now you can see here, the departure index for Toronto will just be -1. So if you try distance with -1, it's simply just not going to work. Distance over here, the valid indices will be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you try -1, you're going to get array index out of bound exception, right? That's why. What we want to do now is to say whenever you see any undefined city, you want to report them all. And then don't do the calculation. You just cannot because it's undefined as far as the table is concerned. So what we'll do now is to redefine, extend the program. Let me switch back to Java perspective over here. So how can we do it? You may want to pause the video and see how you can do it. The expected behavior has been illustrated in the beginning of this week, the video part A. So now let's see how we can do it. Assuming that you thought about it, so what we can do now is, in addition to just trip over here, we can also do another string array over here. Let's say undefined cities over here is going to be assigned to new string, and also the maximum number of undefined cities you can enter will be just, for example, every city the user enter will be just be undefined. So that'll be the maximum, because the user tells us how many cities they're going to enter. Well, more precisely, we're going to prompt the user for this many times. So the maximum number of undefined cities that can be entered will be how many. Okay, so let me just put how many over here. Okay, let me just somehow I lost my focus of the cursor. Okay, that's here, and then we might just need a counter over here to count how many times how many undefined cities we actually got. Initially just integer. I'll just count. Integer number of undefined cities is simply 0. All right. If it ended up just being 0 after we have read all the input from the user, that means there's no error. If the value has been incremented to at least 1, in that case we got at least 1 error, in which case we get to report it, right? And where should we do it? Well, basically over here, if the city over here, you can see the city here. So the city that we read from the user, we're going to check it, right? So we can see this. There's an integer index over here will be this, we can say mileage app2 dot index of, and then the city we are reading right now, right? We can say if the index is strictly less than 0, so that means we got error, right? 0, and we got error. If we got error, what should we do? We should really store the current city, the wrong city, into the undefined city array using the counter over here as the index, right? The counter over here is very similar to the NOF that we spoke about previously for the number of facilities. A similar purpose, right? It tells you how many undefined cities you have read so far, and also what will be the position to store the next undefined city. So we can say here undefined cities at position number of undefined cities, right? It's assigned to simply city, and then we have to increment this number here by 1, right? So that if there's another one that's undefined, we can store it in the incremented value for the counter. Otherwise, we're going to store the city which is defined in the trip array, right? We can either do this way, do the error handling, or we simply store the valid city into the city. All right, and then now we're gonna do a little bit more conditionals over here. So now, so once we exit from the loop, we know that we have already made a decision whether or not there should be some error. So now we should do something like that. We should say if the number of undefined cities is actually, let's say, equal to 0, in that case, we know that all the cities have been saved into the trip array, right? So I don't really need to say too much about the code structure here. It's really combining what you have learned before. You can take this as a case study, right? So let me simply say this. Let me just simply cut this part over here and put it here, right? So that's without the error. What if we got error? And then else, we can simply just do some error message to say what cities are actually undefined. So here we can simply say for integer I, as initialized to be 0, I less than number of undefined cities and I++. And where do we store the undefined cities to? Well, we store them in undefined cities array over here. Let's simply say undefined cities over here. Okay, let's say with some opening curly brackets and also end it with, you know what, actually I don't need this. Why don't I just get rid of it? Doesn't really matter. You can prettify it in whatever way you like. And then here I can say sys out, let's say here in the same line, I'm going to print out the undefined city. Undefined cities at position, simply I over here. And then if I want it to be comma separated, so if I is strictly less than, we have done this many times. And then system out the print line, and then over here like that, right? Okay, why don't we give it a try to make sure it works, and then we can trace it just for one scenario, right? So why don't we try that? Try this. Let's say I got, let's say 4 cities, and then Boston, Toronto, let's say Chicago, and then London. Right, it's going to say undefined cities. You got Toronto and also London and then by, right? I can definitely improve this slightly. Let me just do it here. What I can do is system.out.print over here. So I can say system.out.print over here. And then I can eventually say, after all the list, I can say system.out.print line. Let me just try one more time. Okay. And I don't want a new line between commas. One more time. 4 cities, Boston, Toronto, London, Seoul, for example. You can see now undefined cities will be Toronto, London, and Seoul, right? I think it's working. It's really corresponding to what we showed to you in the very beginning of the week. All right, finally, I would like to trace the code, not really on the iPad, maybe just on the debugger very quickly together with you, showing you some error cases so you will see. If you need further illustration, you can either do it by yourself or you can come to me and I'll visualize that together with you. Let's now put over here, let's say this. Let's put it here, okay? Let's say line 85. So in the loop header for reading the city name, right? Let's now run a debugger. And then how many cities? Let's say 4 cities. And then we're going to switch to the debug perspective over here. And then if I say step over, enter a city, and then let me say if I want to enter Toronto right away. Okay, and then I'll say step over. So the city right now is Toronto, right? It can be, it's being read. And then I'm going to find out the index for Toronto. And for this one, you can step into if you like, but Toronto is simply undefined. So if I say step over, you can see index is simply -1, right? And then -1 is strictly less than 0. So I will say, just go into this branch. if you look at undefined cities array over here, currently it's simply just storing no, right? Because how many is actually 4, right? And now we're going to store at index 0, right? You can see a number of undefined city will be 0. We're going to store at index 0 for this particular array, that particular city. If I say step over, you can see now Toronto is there, right? So Toronto is the first undefined city from the user. And then I'm going to increment the value for number of undefined cities. That'll be 1. So that means if there's another undefined city, I will store that in index 1, which I will show to you. Okay, let's go on to the next iteration. Let's say that for the next iteration, enter a city. Okay, let's now enter something that's valid. Let me say Boston. Okay, and then if I say this, right? So now what will be the index for Boston? It's going to be index 1, right? So something we have seen. And then the index is actually 1, so that's not less than 0. So we'll go to the else part over here. So that means the trip array is actually going to store the value. Oh, you know what? I noticed that because I over here is actually going to be actually 1. But we should really store the city actually not in index 1 because that's the very first valid city. It's good that I trace it. So I should really store something else over here, right? Let me do it again, guys. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing here. So it's a challenge for you to think about why the current version where I simply use I over here to store into the trip is simply not valid, right? As I showed to you in the debugger. So what I should do instead is like this. I should do, for example, trip array, right? Let's say integer number of defined cities. Okay, just to see the contrast. Okay. Initially 0, and what I will do is I'm going to put it here, and then plus plus. You can see the symmetry over here, right? This and also this. All right. Let's now do one more. Okay, let me just do just do 3 cities. Okay, debug. Okay, how many cities? Let's say 3. Okay, and then we are now over here. Okay. Let me switch to, are we now in the debug perspective? Yes, we are. Let me double click on the tab. Okay, so now we're good. So now we're here, and then only 3 cities. So now let's now step over, enter a city. Let's enter something that's valid first of all. Boston, and then the next one, index of the Boston, right? You can see city is now Boston. So now the index will be actually 1. So I should really go to index 1 for the first dimension, and then index will be actually 1, so it's actually not less than 0. So now I will actually go to here, and the trip number of defined cities will just be assigned to city, right? If I do this over here, then you can see number of defined city has been incremented to 1. And if you look at the trip, it's going to be Boston here, right? And then let's say for the second city, I'm going to enter something that's invalid. Okay, let's say London. And then I'm going to step over. Okay, so now what will be the index for the city is now London. What will be the index for that? It should be -1. It's undefined. Okay, so now it's going to be -1 over here, right? So -1 less than 0 is going to be true. So now if I say step over, so now I'm going to use the undefined cities, that number of undefined cities counter. So now that one has been incremented to 1. You can see so far, defined city is 1. Undefined city is also 1. And then if you look at undefined cities array, that actually stores this London over here, right? So it's going to work. Okay. And let me just do one more. Let's say the third iteration, I'm going to enter the third city. Let's say, for example, Seoul, that's also undefined. If I say step over, and the index of Seoul over here should be -1. Right? You can see index is -1. Right? So that means I'm going to go into the if branch. And then, so now number of undefined cities is already being 1 because the previous one is London. So this one here, sorry, click on the wrong counter over here. So now if I try to do it, it's going to store Seoul. Actually, you can see undefined city is going to store it to index 1, corresponding to this counter over here. If I say step over, you can see the undefined cities is actually now you got Seoul actually in this in the first index over here. Exactly, right? And also gonna increment the counter and etc. Okay, so now hopefully for the rest you can just see. So because once we are done, let me just finish the rest. So now we are now here where let's see that if I say step over, so now we are done with the iterations. So now the number of undefined cities is simply over here is 2. 2 is not equal to 0, so we have to do error reporting. Okay, so now if we go to the else part, so we're going to say undefined cities and then print out the comma separated list, right? And then the rest. All right, let me now just do one more testing and then we are done, right? So I think the debugger is really worth doing. You can see I didn't really test it when I actually extended with the error handling extension, but now actually got both cases handled well. Let's now do one more testing and then we are done. How many cities? Let's say we don't have any error. Let's say Boston. Oh, sorry, 4 cities. I made the same mistake again. Let's say 4 cities. Boston, Chicago, and also I forgot what there should be. Okay, and then Miami, and then Houston. Right? You can see all cities are valid over here. Let's try the second case where there's at least one city that's undefined. In this case, I'm going to say how many cities? Let's say 4. Boston. Let's say London, and then Houston. You can see only one, at least one city is actually invalid. So that's why it's reported without calculating any mileage. All right. So now we are done for this complete example here. We got 2 versions, one version with multiple single one-dimensional array variables, and the other version with just a single 2-dimensional array variable. So it's really a nice case study for you to see how we go transition from one into another. It's much better design if you stick to the 2-dimensional array. And also we spoke about the basic syntax for 2-dimensional array. And also we use debugger to actually find a bug. Actually, when I ran through a debugger, hopefully you can also learn from that. All right, that's it. And then for next week, we'll resume back to the two-dimensional arrays by introducing more utility methods to talk about more complex algorithms on the 2-dimensional arrays. That'll be for next week. All right, see you next week.